Welcome, everyone. Once getting in. Welcome, welcome. Glad to have you here. Good to see you today. Thank you for joining us.
Hey guys, how are you?
Hey, how are you, Dr. Aldridge? We've got Dr. Ferguson here. It's a whole party. All right. Looks like people are jumping in. That's great. Thank you for coming. We're going to go ahead and get started because we have so many good things we want to share with you today and always limited time. That's like the story of our lives as teachers, right? So let's go ahead and get started. Um, we are here today to talk about literacy triage, supporting our older learners. My name is Shannon Bowles. I am an educator and partnership consultant with Reading Horizons, and I'm joined today by two wonderful people from Mississippi, Dr. Amy Ferguson and Dr. Shannon Eldridge. And today, Dr. Ferguson will be hopping on a little later in the webinar to share some additional insights and some thoughts about this topic after we kind of cover some of the content. And next week, if you're joining us again next week, Dr. Eldridge will be on to share some additional content with us. So let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to cover today. We're going to look at the science of reading and structured literacy. We're going to look at some common themes and what we see in classrooms with struggling readers, and identify and understand the principles and elements of the structured literacy model, specifically for grades 3 through 12 for those older learners, as well as looking at how we can plan for effective mastery of skill-based solutions for these students. As we're talking today, I want you to be thinking about what you're seeing in your classroom, what your students are saying. Maybe I'm sure one of these will resonate with you, but maybe you hear kids saying, well, I read it, but I don't understand. Or I read it, but I got to the end and I don't remember what I read. Or I'm a slow reader, or I don't like to read, or I don't like to read aloud. Reading is boring. It's too much. Reading makes me tired. Or just asking us, how do you say this word? Right? So lots of things that we see with these students, especially in these upper grades, that hopefully are kind of resonating with you. And we're going to start off by examining the simple view of reading. The simple view of reading outlines the foundation of all reading skills and helps us understand how each component affects reading comprehension. So first we have this component of decoding of text, and this includes phonemic awareness, the alphabetic principle, kind of unlocking the code of orthographic patterns and fluency. And then we have language comprehension, which is going to include things like vocabulary and syntax and pragmatics and discourse. And some of these items can be affected by home language, socioeconomic status, additional language deficits. These two components together are going to bring us to reading to gain meaning or reading comprehension. That whole picture comes together when we have both decoding of text and the ability to understand the oral and written language as a whole. That's when we're going to get our students reading to gain meaning. And this includes all of those things that we think of with comprehension, background knowledge and text structure and purpose of reading, complexity. All of those things come together in reading to gain meaning. But what's really powerful about the simple view of reading is that this is a time sign in this equation. That tells us that this product can only be as high as the lowest factor in the equation. So when either one of these components is weak, we are going to see that showing up in reading comprehension. Another model that is great to look at here is Scarborough's reading rope. You may have seen this before, but I kind of think of it as a great way to transition from the simple view to something with a little more detail, kind of taking those two buckets of components and dumping them out into these strands and looking at how those interact over time to build students' reading abilities. So starting with that decoding of text or word recognition, that's these bottom strands in blue that we see: phonological awareness, phonics decoding, sight recognition. And we need these strands, these skills, to become increasingly automatic for students. so that over time, as they develop automaticity with those skills, then they have some cognitive bandwidth available to get into these language comprehension skills, background knowledge, and language structure. And these all kind of weave together over time to give us fluency. Fluency is not a separate skill that's taught within the rope. It's something that happens as students are able to accurately decode and then be able to start attending to meaning so that their reading sounds more like speaking and not real choppy. That's when we get that fluency. So this is kind of what we're going to be grounding our discussions in. I want everyone to have a good background in kind of what the research shows is most effective for and necessary for our students to learn how to read. From here, we're going to look at the reading pyramid. The research is really clear that every student benefits from instruction in 5 essential components of reading that have been identified by the National Reading Panel in a big meta-analysis of decades of scientific research in reading development. And the essential components include instruction in phonemic awareness, there at the bottom, explicit, systematic, and sequential phonics, fluency, vocabulary development, and comprehension strategies. And the National Reading Panel also explained that teachers need to explicitly teach this instruction in a systematic way that's organized and structured from simple skills to more complex skills. And when we look at this pyramid as teachers of older students, we often kind of take a top down approach in this pyramid. But we tend to live for a long time in that comprehension piece. We talk about a lot of strategies. We keep trying to get students to understand, but we never really look at the root issue or that main cause of why students struggle with the comprehension. We don't need to present students with strategies and strategies and strategies. We want to focus on skill-based solutions that will empower students to apply these skills on their own in content area text. I love this quote from Dr. Anita Archer. There is no comprehension strategy powerful enough to compensate for the fact that you can't read the words. Just let that sink in for a second. They can't get there if they can't read the words. So, what if we took a bottom up approach? Let's start at the beginning and see where they are with the very foundational pieces of phonemic awareness and phonics decoding, fill those gaps, then move up. An explicit and systematic approach is going to build students' ability to recognize patterns in the English language and eliminates the need to rely solely on memorizing words or identifying parts of words that they already know. These are compensation strategies that our students are very familiar with and have used for a very long time as struggling readers. And with older students, it's also important to remember that as we're working on those word recognition skills, kind of focusing on filling those gaps at the bottom of the pyramid, that doesn't mean that we should be ignoring the top. We should also provide instruction on skills at the top of the pyramid that support comprehension. But until students are fluent decoders, they won't really be able to access that highest level of comprehension independently. So we can do things like read alouds, give them rich text where we're working with them with support. But this also just helps us understand how important it is to correctly identify the root cause of the reading difficulty and then build from there. So, how do we teach skills in a way that's going to be equitable for all students to access and learn across the tiers and throughout grade levels? Structured literacy is that answer. So, structured literacy is an umbrella term coined by the International Dyslexia Association, and it applies to any programs or approaches that teach these inner researched elements and utilize these outer teaching principles that you see on the outside of this circle. So, anytime we're teaching these skills, we need to make sure we're doing so explicitly. We're being clear and direct about this skill. It's not up for guessing. If they were going to get it on their own, they would have already gotten it. Clear and direct. We also want to be systematic, deliberately sequencing skills in an order that moves from simple to complex, and cumulative, teaching each of those skills to mastery before building additional skills on top. And finally, that last piece is being diagnostic. If we're going to teach something to mastery, we're going to need to have some data to show that students are actually mastering that skill before we move to the next one. And if they're not, it allows us to respond and adapt to what those students need. So this is kind of the roadmap, structured literacy. Now let's shift just a little bit and look at this cycle of behavior, because this is a common theme, what we see in our classrooms. I know I want you all to be thinking of some students in your mind that this applies to. We give our students a grade level academic task. We say, read this article, right? For example, the student engages in some kind of problem behavior. They flip their hoodie up over their head. They put their head down on their desk. They all of a sudden have a stomach ache and need to go to the nurse or need to use the bathroom for 20 minutes. And, whatever it might be, they're the class clown. They start disrupting and, making funny noises, whatever. Student engages in some kind of problem behavior. And as a result, the teacher either removes the academic task or removes the student from the classroom, sends them to the office, or they end up at the nurse or wherever. And as a result, the student escapes that academic task, which was kind of their whole goal in the first place. But what we see is that students' academic skills never improve because this cycle continues throughout the school year. And so they don't ever catch up and improve on their skills. So hopefully everybody kind of can resonate with that cycle. So how do we break this cycle for our students? We want to make sure we're looking at our information, looking at our data, targeting skill instruction, and helping our students feel more empowered and confident that they can engage with the academic task. There's a direct correlation between student behavior and reading scores. If we have students with chronic behavior problems, we should be looking at their reading scores first thing and finding the root of the issue for that student. I love this short but sweet quote from Dr. Michelle Newell in Oakland, California. She says, reading is everyone's responsibility. It's not just on us if we are the ELA teacher or if we are the SPED teacher or whatever. Everyone should be focusing on supporting students in their literacy goals and needs. There are a lot of factors that kind of impact reading skills for students: hearing impairment, phonological processing issues, visual impairment, ADHD, cognition issues, working memory deficits, limited vocabulary or background knowledge, learning disabilities. So lots of different things that can play in here, which sometimes is why we feel a little bit overwhelmed, I think. 'Cause we think, oh my gosh, there's just so many things at play. How do I even approach this student? And sometimes we might be working with students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and that impacts their literacy skills as well. They might have more limited vocabulary or background knowledge, which is going to impair their comprehension as well. One of the greatest contributing factors to difficulties with reading is learning disabilities. And the most common reason for learning disabilities in reading is dyslexia. So, despite knowing that this is the case, a lot of dyslexic readers are incorrectly diagnosed or never diagnosed and are identified for special education support for a specific learning disability, SLD. And this makes it really tricky for teachers of older students because you might not know that they are struggling with dyslexia. And it gets harder to get down to that root cause. But it is also hard for students because if they don't know, if they don't have a diagnosis, it can be harder for them to advocate for themselves and understand that it's not an intelligence issue. It's this thing that their brain does that they need more support with reading. So just kind of looking at the numbers, I think this is really powerful. Specific learning disability is the largest percent of students in SPED, and 85% of those students are struggling with reading. Most of the time, it's a decoding issue. So we have to begin with the IEP because that's the roadmap to supporting these students. We want to make sure that all departments are in alignment to create IEP goals, including the gen ed teacher, the SLP, the SPED teacher, intervention, EL, any other departments that might be involved. And then we need to choose appropriate skills, kind of go that bottom up approach again, going back to the bottom of the pyramid, working our way up, choosing appropriate skills and standards and establishing goals for students that provide a plan to lead the student to exit this tier of instruction. So those are kind of the big takeaways here: is looking at that data as a whole team, bottom up, choosing those appropriate skills and standards to work on, and then creating goals that are of course going to help them achieve those skills and standards, but also with a clear path, with exit criteria from this, so that they don't live here forever. This is not their entire academic career. Now, we talked about how dyslexia is a very common factor in reading difficulties. In fact, it impacts about 20% of the population. I have a daughter with dyslexia, an eighth grader, so that's fun where I'm at in both parenting and educating. But dyslexia is not a new thing, not a new term. I feel like we're hearing it a lot right now, and we used to not hear about it so much, but it's not actually a new thing. In the early 1900s, late 1800s, it was called congenital word blindness by an ophthalmologist who studied groups of children who were unable to learn to read. This little excerpt from, oh, excuse me, that was here it is. Okay. This little excerpt from the British Medical Journal kind of illustrates what it is, and this will probably resonate with you, thinking about some of these students in your groups. The schoolmaster who has taught him for some years says that he would be the smartest lad in the school if the instruction were entirely oral. Right? This holds true for our students today. A lot of our students with dyslexia or dyslexic features will present as bright and engaging and funny and smart. And then we ask them to read out loud for us. And it just is so taxing and scary for them. So, what is dyslexia? Let's look at just a quick definition. It's the most common of all neurocognitive disorders. In 2019, the IDA defined dyslexia as a specific learning disability that is neurological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling or decoding issues or abilities, excuse me. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. It's kind of a scientific definition. But the things that stick out to me here are that it's neurological in origin. We know what the characteristics are: struggles with fluency, word recognition, spelling, and it is typically resulting from a deficit in the phonological component of language. And that it's an unexpected reading difficulty in relation to other strengths a student might have. So just kind of keeping that in mind, some additional characteristics of dyslexia that we know now from research is that it has a strong genetic component. It's highly likely to run in families. You might speak with a student and their parent, and you explain what's happening, and the parent's like having an epiphany of like, I think I have dyslexia, right? This is me. So family history for sure. Sometimes we're seeing issues where we're seeing errors that don't have any correlation to the sounds of the letters on the page. Like we're reading, students are reading words that are not actually there based on context or illustrations. And also another common characteristic is a difficulty with rapid automatized or automatic naming, or RAN difficulties. This is where it's difficult for students to have quick automatic recall of letters and sounds that they've learned. Um, this makes reading slow and laborious and tiring. It really is more effort for these students to read than their counterparts. So we want to make sure that we're supplying students with the skills that they need and the exposures that they need. Working memory plays a role here as well. There's a really strong correlation between certain specific learning disabilities and working memory difficulties. So in Understanding Working Memory, a classroom guide, psychologists Gather-Cole and Alloway report that approximately 70% of students with SLDs in reading score very low on working memory assessments. So something that is something that's very rarely seen in students who do not have specific learning disabilities. So we have to take that into consideration with our students and with the accommodations that we're providing by giving them ample opportunities for repetition. These students need far more exposures to skills and more repetitions with skills than their gen ed counterparts who don't have these difficulties. And the other thing I want to point out about dyslexia is it's often referred to as a hidden disability, and that resonates deeply with me as a parent, just because it's not real obvious, and our students often will have a lot of compensation strategies that they use to hide it further because our society stigmatizes illiteracy so much. They don't want people to know they can't read well. So that's important to know and to help them understand too, our students, that dyslexia is not caused by laziness or inattention or any of these other things. It's not related to their low to intelligence. Um, so we want to empower these kids to know, hey, you're okay, and I'm going to give you the instruction that you need to get there, right? And oftentimes they're not diagnosed. It's actually pretty rare to get a full dyslexia diagnosis. So look for these characteristics, look for those hallmarks, and treat it like you would if they had the diagnosis, because that's what they're going to need. Last thing about dyslexia before we move on is I really love Sally Shaywitz's Sea of Strengths model, because dyslexia is kind of that hidden disability. And oftentimes, our students who have IEPs, we focus a lot on their deficits instead of their strengths. But it's a good example of how we can kind of redirect our focus to their strengths, helping build those students up, focusing on things that they are good at and that they love, and then filling in those gaps that they need. We have students. I know you have students like this. They can answer any question, they can have these great conversations with you, but they don't perform well on tests. Written assignments are a struggle. And because we often associate reading ability with intelligence, the students get kind of overlooked. So we want to make sure that we're praising those strengths and then helping them hone in on this thing that is hard for them, reading. Okay, so let's kind of switch gears a little bit here, just talking about additional students we might be working with. Older students who are acquiring the English language. We have some of those, I assume, in the room. What does that look like? We've got students who are developing their language proficiency, and that is a process. It takes a long time. Um, Students receive supports every day. And so if you think about like pre-K, kinder, first grade student, they're going to take about 3 to 5 years to develop the basics of language. And this is with everyday explicit instruction and repetition in those foundational skills. And the same is true for our older learners who are acquiring language. And they need that same amount of time, and they're not necessarily getting as much explicit instruction and repetition of foundational skills as our primary grade students. So it's really important to note too here that not only are they acquiring, everyday conversational English, but we're asking them to develop their academic English, because we're asking students to acquire both receptive and expressive language and interact with text that does the same. And so it's not just reading words on a page, it's understanding the semantics and having background knowledge and understanding structures of language. So there's a lot of things that are going into this. And so we have to remember that this is a process that develops over time. However, the good news is structured literacy is the path for these learners as well. So what does structured literacy actually look like in a classroom? I'm going to show you just kind of an example of a systematic and cumulative instructional design. This follows the gradual release of responsibility, that I do, we do, you do approach. As we move through a lesson, it's going to build students' strengths as they go. So starting with a review, making sure they have that previously taught skill before we move on to something new. Explicit instruction, that's the I do, the teacher's explicitly, clearly, and directly teaching the skill. Dictation or some guided practice that we do, where students are getting lots of repetition and opportunities to practice the skill with immediate corrective feedback and support. And then that transfer piece, making sure that they're able to move that skill out of isolation and into context and start applying the skill. Now, Reading Horizons uses a marking system with our program as we teach skills that acts as a visual support to students to help them to see the patterns in English. It's kind of like the FedEx logo. There's an arrow between the E and the X. If you've never seen it, there it is. But once you've seen that arrow between the E and the X, you just never unsee it. It's just always there, kind of popping out at you as the truck drives by, you see the arrow. And that's kind of how a marking system works. It allows students to have a visual of the pattern. And even as we pull that back, that pops out for students. They start to recognize those patterns in text. Of course, we're going to start bottom up. Make sure they've got the alphabetic principle, ensure that they're able to name letters and correctly know all the correct sounds for these letters. Surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly to you, that is almost always, there's always a gap somewhere in here when I go back to the beginning with my older learners. We also want to make sure that they have letter formation. For our older learners, a lot of them, if they've been using an alphabetic language, they've already got formation down. Even if it's really messy, it's pretty hard to undo. So maybe not the biggest focus, but making sure they have that letter sound correspondence. And then we start building. We might use kinesthetic cues. At Reading Horizons, we use kinesthetic cues for short vowels to avoid vowel confusion. And then we are going to build to what we call a slide, where we're combining a consonant and a vowel together. We mark it with an arrow to show that we're sliding these sounds left to right, and also to show students this is not a complete word yet. There's more to come. So then we're going to add on that ending consonant. We've got the slide ma. We're going to add on that ending consonant p to build the word map, and identify the key feature of the vowel here by marking it with an X. Every word has to have a vowel or vowel sound, and it helps us identify syllables because that's the hallmark of a syllable. Syllable is a vowel or vowel sound. And from there, we want to always move it into context, into sentences, ideally sentences that are decodable, that students can both read and write. We also teach orthographic patterns like spelling. One example is how to spell with C and K when they make the same sound. K. We teach that with a rhyme. K takes I and E, C takes the other three, A, O, and U. Simple, powerful, explicit. They're going to be able to connect with that. From there, we move to not just identifying key features and marking them within a word, but proving why the vowel is short or long within a word. And we introduce kind of a visual spatial process for that, where we're working underneath the word and then around the top of the word and looking what follows the vowel, because that's what determines its pronunciation. And we teach that within a framework called the 5 phonetic skills. So left to right, we're identifying the vowel A, and then coming up and around the end, we have one consonant following that vowel. We term it a guardian consonant. A guardian protects. It's going to help that vowel keep its short sound. The word is gap. So one guardian consonant makes the vowel short. That's phonetic skill 1. Phonetic skill 2, we're still identifying key features left to right. And now we're looking at what follows the vowel here. 2 guardian consonants prove the vowel short. The word is lift. That's phonetic skills 1 and 2 are closed syllables. Phonetic skill 3 is an open syllable. So left to right, we identify the vowel E, and then coming up and around the end, we don't see anything following the vowel, and there's no previous vowels. So we say the vowel stands alone. When the vowel stands alone, it will be long. This word is me. Those first 3 phonetic skills represent our most common syllable types. And once students master those, they can already attack about 75% of the text we put in front of them. Phonetic skill 4, we've got vowel I and vowel E, but E is at the end with a previous vowel. So that E will be silent, proving the previous vowel long. The word is hike. And finally, phonetic skill 5 has to do with adjacent vowel teams. When we have certain vowels that are right next to each other, the second vowel is silent and the first vowel is long. And we explicitly teach those 9 adjacent vowel teams that this applies to. And then we teach additional adjacent vowel patterns and pronunciations later on. From here, once students are successfully able to prove vowel sounds in single syllable words, we get them to multisyllabic words. And we want to do this as quickly as we can because we know our older learners need to be able to read multisyllabic words. And we teach 2 simple skills here. When we have a word with more than 1 syllable, like this word, we know we have more than 1 syllable here. We look at what's between those vowels. And decoding skill 1 tells us that when there's 1 consonant between the vowels, it's going to move with the next syllable, or 1 must run. So we divide in front of that consonant and then apply the 5 phonetic skills to prove the vowel sound in each syllable. The word is motel. Decoding skill 2 is similar. We've got 2 consonants between our vowels this time. Decoding skill 2 tells us 2 will split. So we divide between those 2 consonants and then apply the 5 phonetic skills to prove the vowel sound in each syllable. Campus. Okay, so simple skills that are going to build student motivation by increasing student confidence and belief in their ability to be a reader, and reducing perceived difficulty. When we present things in a simple way that they can access and start from the bottom up, they don't have that feeling of it's so overwhelming and so hard. It's more empowering. Oh, I could do this. I can do this skill. And then we build the next skill and the next until we get them to the point that they can do this, that they can use this framework in their content area grade level texts. Because the whole point is that we're giving them a scaffolded support to help them be able to decode unfamiliar words when they're on their own. These students, this is in DeSoto County Schools. These students were in the bottom 25% in DeSoto, and they are applying these skills to a history text and a science text on their own. And over the last 2 years, these schools in DeSoto have made over 20 points growth on their benchmark assessments. And this is translating to their core classes as well, which is exactly what we want to see. Okay, so let me bring on Dr. Amy Ferguson. She's been here the whole time, but we're gonna chat with her for a minute. Thanks for joining us, Amy.
All right.
Okay, so we have a couple questions for Amy today. First of all, how have you been able to identify some of your student needs, your
So,
identification?
so basically, our response to intervention programs and within our schools help us to identify students. So we look at like a triangulation of data. So we look at classroom performance. We look at our universal screening data, which often tells us the most about gaps in their reading. Basically, those foundational skills that we don't always see in the classroom, because you're right, we do typically with our older students stay at the top in that comprehension. And so those universal screeners give us some information about where in that continuum are students having problems. And then we also use our benchmark assessments that tell us about grade level skills and how the students are working toward our state assessments, which will come at the end of the school year. So we use
Right,
all of that data to try to determine which students need the most supports.
right. Yeah. And then from there, you have a lot of good information to start with, and then you can start filling gaps.
Yeah.
Bottom up. Okay,
Yes.
so what have you done once you have students identified? Then what have you done to help kind of support those different types of learners that we talked about today?
Well, one thing we found in our particular district are these are students who are transient. So they will wake up on one side of town one night, and then the next morning they'll be at another school across town. And when I
Mm.
first started with our district, we had different processes and different programs in different schools. So these students were not benefiting from getting this segmented approach for intervention, because we were over here and there would be a program that they started with, and then they would move over here and there'd be something new and different. And that was one of our major struggles in the beginning. And
Mhm.
then over time, we've kind of taken an approach of looking at the big five, trying to find where those gaps are or what we know about the student in all areas, and
Right.
try to pick interventions that we think would best suit their needs. So we have a variety of different interventions that we use. We do have some students who are in dyslexia therapy with a CALT certified therapist from the
Mhm.
district level. So we have a therapist in every school that's working with students who have a true dyslexia diagnosis. But there are a lot of students in the public school system who do not have a diagnosis, but we see these same characteristics. And
Yes.
those are the students that Reading Horizons have really helped in our district. So we have put Reading Horizons as a tool that we're using in grades 3 through 6 right now, and we're going to grow that next year. So we're growing with this population. So seventh and eighth grade is coming on, and high school's looking at it as well. So we're looking at going all the way up with our older learners. But what we found, the interesting thing, Shannon, is when this product came to us and we looked at it, I was like, well, we've tried all. I'm being as just transparent. I was like, we've tried all these things. This is like the same song, second verse. We've done this type of strategy before. What would make us think that this would get us a different result? But, since we've tried everything else, let's just try it. So we put it into our 3-5 schools, and immediately our students started showing this tremendous growth. And so I thought, well, what is it? What is that piece that makes this different? So I went around and I was observing, and I'll tell you what I think it is. It's the confidence piece. Because when you were talking about going down and then growing with the students, when you go into those tutorial classes, those students are confident. They're like, I can do this. Watch what I can do. And it's because we started at a point that they were somewhat independent and we grew from there. Whereas in other strategies, we were looking for their gaps and starting where there was already a gap. And I think that's made a real big difference in our students and what they're able to do.
I got chills. Thanks, Amy. I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, and I love that you brought up that confidence piece because research shows that motivation and confidence piece like trumps almost everything else in reading proficiency when their motivation to read
Yeah, and
is more important than almost anything else.
I've never seen groups of students so excited about reading. Like I've never
Hmm.
seen this is my life's work, intervention and reading strategies and that kind of thing, and trying to make sure that all children are literate. But
Hmm.
you walk in these particular rooms and these groups, these students are engaged in what they are doing, and they the air just feels like I'm confident. Give me another one. Let me show you what I can do, which
Yeah.
is not something you typically see in older students that are struggling.
Right. Right. Oh, love it. And I think it's so great too to watch them understand the why. I love it
Mhm.
when I get to observe and a student explains to me what they're doing and why. And they know exactly why that vowel is short and they know exactly why they're going to split it here. And it's so
They do.
empowering for them. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Okay, well, thank you so much. Appreciate you sharing those insights with us, Amy, and thank you for being
Anytime.
with us. We appreciate your time today. We've identified a lot of different learning difficulties today. Next week, we're going to talk about skill-based solutions and also age-appropriate instructional practices. And Dr. Shannon Eldridge will be back next week to share some of her insights there. So thanks for joining us. If you're attending live, because there will be a recording, but if you're attending live, there's a poll that's going to pop up on your screen. If you can take just a moment to fill out that poll for us, it's just one question. We would greatly appreciate it. And if you are watching this recorded and you would like some more information about Reading Horizons or get in touch with someone from Reading Horizons, feel free to email us at info@readinghorizons.com and we will connect with you and talk more. And hopefully we'll see you all next week. Thank you so much. Bye.
All right, Shannon, we're just going to leave the poll up for a minute because not everybody's had a chance to answer, if that's
Sure.
okay.
Absolutely. Oh, and you know what? I saw a question in the Q&A while we're letting
Yeah,
people finish up
yeah.
the poll. I don't know if Betty's still here. Maybe she left, but she asked, "Are these new posters for Reading Horizons?" Oh, yeah. There's not new posters for Elevate, but if you're talking about K3, there's some new posters in there. But Elevate does come with those reference posters, so all the skills are available to have up in your classroom for student reference. I'm not sure if that was the question because I'm not sure what slide it was on. But if you
Yeah.
need more info, reach out to us. We'll be sure to connect with you.
All right,
Oh,
we've
you are
got
here.
almost 60% participation. If you're still on, it looks like most of you are. If you wouldn't mind just you can just basically say yes or no. We'd love to get 100% participation. So we'll just keep you another 30 seconds or so. Okay. Oops, going up there now, Shannon.
Perfect.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you. Okay,
Oh,
appreciate it. Bye.
okay.